Good morning. I'd invite you to open your Bibles to Hebrews chapter 12. And we're going to be basing our lesson out of a couple verses there in that chapter that we'll be looking at in just a moment. It's good to be back with all of you. This last week, Abigail and I were in what she called Summer Sunset. And I was preaching for the church there at Southside for, I guess it was Sunday through Wednesday. And it was good to be with all of those brethren. Good to be back with you guys. There's a lot of the brethren there that know a lot of the people here. A lot of close connections between members of both of those churches. And so it was good for me to get to know more people that know you guys. That was an enjoyable experience for me. But it is good to be back home, as I always feel when I'm driving back here. This just feels like home, I hope, for a long time. And so this morning, I want us to start our lesson by looking at Hebrews chapter 12. Look at verse 15, and look at just the beginning of this verse in Hebrews 12:15. See to it that no one fails to obtain the grace of God. Now, let me just stop there. I want you to notice that in verse 15 here, the thing that the writer of Hebrews tells us is at stake is that you might not obtain God's grace. See to it that nobody fails to obtain the grace of God. We're supposed to watch out for one another, it seems like, at the beginning of this verse. But what is it that might cause people to not obtain the grace of God? You might think that it's going to be one of those really bad sins that, are the things that people that go to jail the rest of their life would do or something. But notice that the rest of the verse goes on to say that no root of bitterness springs up and causes trouble, and by it many become defiled. The thing that might cause you to not obtain God's grace is something that he calls a root of bitterness that could spring up. And I think part of what he's saying here is that make sure that nobody in your congregation has got this root that springs up and starts defiling a bunch of people. And the danger is any one of us might be that person that's got this root of bitterness that springs up, and I spread my bitterness to other people, and that bitterness causes other people to be defiled, causing other people to not obtain the grace of God either. Is bitterness something that we sometimes want to hold on to? If I can hold on to my bitterness, I have my reasons why I haven't grown past my struggles, and you all better get off of my back because I've got a reason why I am the way that I am. Some of us, we can sometimes nurse our bitterness as a manipulation tactic to get people to not have to challenge us. And this passage wants us to know at the beginning here that what's at stake is you not obtaining the grace of God. And you possibly defiling other people because of your bitterness. Now, I'll look at verse 14 and 15 together. Strive for peace with everyone, and for the holiness without which no one will see the Lord. See to it that no one fails to obtain the grace of God, that no root of bitterness springs up and causes trouble, and by it many become defiled. Now, I want to loosely base our points from this lesson on these two verses. We're going to draw in some other passages, but we're going to root our lesson in this passage. And I want us to think about these 3 points. What is a root of bitterness, or what a root of bitterness is? Secondly, what are the fruits that come from a root of bitterness? And then thirdly, the healing of the root of bitterness. So those will be the 3 things that we look at this morning. Here's the first point. What a root of bitterness is. If you were to describe to somebody what not just bitterness, but a root of bitterness is, how would you describe what that is? The Greek word for bitterness here is the word pikria, something like that, and it means this. It's used of taste, meaning bitter, acrid, brackish. Metaphorically, it means bitter, cruel, malignant, indicating bitter, harsh, cruel feelings. This word is related to another word, pikros, which means something like sharp or piercing. And when you look at the definition of pikria, you can see how this idea of something being sharp or piercing would fit into that idea as well. And you can see that there's a metaphorical and there's a literal use of this term. So it has a literal use for taste. In fact, you know the English word biting, for something to be biting, comes from the word bitter. Have you ever eaten something that was just biting, or it was bitter? Maybe you think about having a cranberry. If you're going to have a cranberry, you're going to mix it with something else. Like Samantha makes this cranberry thing that has cream cheese in it and stuff. And it's like a really good salsa dip kind of thing that she makes with it. But if it was just the cranberries, it would be really bitter. Maybe you remember the first time you ever had coffee. If you've ever had apple cider vinegar to try to make your immune system strong, you know that when you've had things like that it leaves this lingering taste. And that's what the literal meaning of it is, but it works from the literal to the metaphorical. Have you ever had a pungent, acrid, malignant kind of feeling that something's happened in your life and it leaves this bitter resentment that you have? This Greek word, pikria, is used 4 times in the New Testament. Do you remember in Acts chapter 8 when there was Simon the sorcerer? And before Philip the evangelist come, everybody said about Simon the sorcerer, this man is the power of God that is called great. Here's this guy that gets all of this attention and all these accolades and praise for the things that he was doing in that town. But then Philip the evangelist come, and rather than people paying attention to Simon the sorcerer, people start to pay attention to Philip. You remember after some time when Peter comes and he lays hands on people and then the Holy Spirit is distributed to those people so that they can do miraculous abilities, that Simon the sorcerer looks at Peter doing that kind of work, and you can imagine at this point that he's been converted, but his old self is coming back. And he misses the attention that he used to get for having everybody pay attention to him. And do you remember when he asks Peter, hey, Peter, can I pay you enough money for me to be able to lay hands on people and be able to give them miraculous abilities as well? I would like to be a top dog again. So how much is it going to cost to do that? And what Peter says to him, he says, for I see that you are in the gall of bitterness and in the bond of iniquity. What's going on with Simon? I'm being outshined right now. I'm not the top sheriff in town anymore. There's somebody else that's outshining me, and it's frustrating me, and I'm losing sleep over it, and I want to try to package it in holy language. Notice that even religious people can seek after religious things. And do you suppose when Simon came up to Peter, he said to him, it's confusing, Simon, and then he goes up to Peter, whose other name is Simon. But Simon goes up to Peter and says, hey, I would really like to be able to buy this ability. Do you suppose he just shows that his real motive is bitterness? Or do you think he baptizes his language in holy kind of speech? And then Peter says, what's behind all of this is you're just bitter. You've got this lasting resentment that you're not the guy that everybody looks up to anymore. That's what bitterness means. This lasting resentment, this harsh, cruel kind of feeling that you can have towards something or somebody. But this is described as a root. Well, what does the root imagery mean? Every root would begin with some kind of a seed. A seed has to be planted. And there's got to be the soil for that seed to be planted. Well, what is the seed that plants a root of bitterness? Now, I like what Jim Wilson says about this. Guilt is what we feel when we sin, and bitterness is what we feel when others sin against us. And I'll add that it's not only when people sin against us, it's when we imagine somebody may have sinned against us, even if they didn't actually sin against us. And you can expand that out even more. You might have had a period of time in your life where you lived in a certain city, and you're bitter towards that city because things weren't going the way that you wanted them to. You might have a season in your life that you're bitter about because things weren't going the way that you wanted them to. So it's maybe not even directed so much towards a particular person, but it's towards a particular place or particular time in your life. But we get bitter when something or somebody has wronged us, either whether it's real or we imagine that it's happened that way. Go back to Hebrews chapter 10, as long as you're in the book of Hebrews. And I want to show you some of the most detail that we get about the audience of the book of Hebrews. And look at verses 32 to 34 of chapter 10. But recall the former days when, after you were enlightened, you endured a hard struggle with sufferings. Now, before we keep reading, notice that the Bible says you're enlightened and then you suffered. The world says that you're enlightened and then your suffering goes away, but in the way that the Bible works, you get enlightened and then suffering starts. But look at verse 33. Sometimes being publicly exposed to reproach in affliction, and sometimes being partners with those so treated. For you had compassion on those in prison, and you joyfully accepted the plundering of your property, since you knew that you yourselves had a better possession and an abiding one. All right, what is it that this audience is going through? You guys have been enlightened, and now your property is being seized. And now you're being publicly reproached. Can you imagine walking down the streets, people going, oh, that's one of those people that won't confess Caesar as Lord. He says that this guy named Jesus is Lord, and he's not serving Caesar like he should be. These are bad people in our town. We should take their property. And so all of these really bad things are happening to these people, but yet the writer of Hebrews still says, you don't have a right to be bitter. It doesn't matter what your circumstances are. It doesn't matter how bad things are. You don't let this seed get planted. Or if the seed gets planted, you don't let it grow. It's never going to shoot out and bear fruit if you don't allow the root system to start. But you think about, you go from just the seed being planted, some wrong done against you, some season in your life that you didn't like, and you don't take the seed out. Instead, what ends up happening is these root systems start to be created, and these root systems get entrenched into the way that you think about everything, and you start to just become a cynical person about everything around you. These roots mingle their way into the way that you act in every circumstance, the way that you look at everything around you, until eventually it sprouts up in this passage. In Hebrews 12:15, it says that it can spring up. You can say all day long, I'm not bitter, I'm not bitter, I'm not bitter. But if you let that root system keep growing and you didn't take the seed out, you don't pull the roots out, it will sprout up. Now, I'm going to talk in just a moment about what it sprouts up into, but before we do that, just examine yourself. Where are you in this process right now? Has there been some wrong done against you recently that you keep nursing, and you're not getting the shovel out to dig it out? But instead, you're letting the root system continually grow, and it's just causing you to become a cynical person, and then it eventually starts coming out in everything that you say and do. Now, this isn't saying that you're going to forget all the wrong things that have been done against you. Do you remember in 2 Timothy 4:14 where Paul talks about Alexander the coppersmith who did me great harm, and the Lord will repay him? Did Paul forget all the wrong things that were done against him? Well, he didn't forget it, but he wasn't nursing a grudge about it. He didn't have continually resentful feelings about these sorts of things. So are you a bitter person? Or maybe the better question to ask, the more realistic question is, what are you tempted to be bitter about right now? What wrongs have been done against you? What circumstances in life are you upset about that you're allowing to stew within you? The second thing to think about then is, what is the fruit that comes from the root of bitterness? Well, what is it that it starts to do to manifest itself that shows that you have it? Remember what Jesus said in Luke 6:43 and 44? For no good tree bears bad fruit, nor again does a bad tree bear good fruit. For each tree is known by its own fruit. For figs are not gathered from thorn bushes, nor are grapes picked from a bramble bush. Jesus uses this language in other places, that you can tell what kind of root system that tree has. You can tell what its DNA is based on what's coming and surfacing. What kind of fruit is being born in your speech, your attitudes, your actions? If you're a bitter person, here's some examples of some of these things. You're unforgiving. Now, because you want to be a holy and pious person, you want to say the right things, and so you'll say, oh, yeah, I forgive you. But do you know what forgiveness means? Forgiveness is a promise to not use something against somebody anymore. Remember in Jeremiah 31, I will remember their sins no more. I'll remove their iniquities from them. When God says in Jeremiah 31, I will remember their sin no more, does that mean that God could never recall it again? Oh, yeah, I remember what you did. No, to remember something means I'm not going to keep holding it over you. I'm not going to keep using it against you. So even though you might tell somebody, oh, yeah, I forgive you, the moment you start pulling it out as a club to manipulate that person again, you haven't really forgiven them in your heart. You've only said the words, but if you're an unforgiving person, it doesn't matter how kindly you've said you've forgiven somebody, but if you keep using it as a club against them, then you haven't forgiven them. Another piece of evidence that you've got this root system growing is that you're vengeful. Now again, you want to be holy about this, so you would never say, I want to go hurt that person, but you wouldn't mind having some popcorn and watching that person get hurt by somebody else. What about grumbling? Grumbling about the government, grumbling about the state of the nation, grumbling about a certain restaurant that didn't give you your food on time the way you wanted it because you're a king, and you get all upset about all kinds of things, and you're never going to go back to that place again. But you stew on it. Grumbling, complaining comes from a place of bitterness. What about isolation or antisocial behavior? I'm not saying all of that is always going to be bitterness, but I'm going to say that a lot of it is at times. I'm not going to go to that thing that I was invited to. Probably nobody would care about me there anyways. I'm not going to do this. Probably nobody would reach out to me anyway. Well, what is that? Except for feeling like you've been wronged. And so I'm just going to isolate myself from everybody. And every time I'm invited to things, it's never going to happen. I'm never going to be around those people because they make me feel insecure because I feel like they're better than me in some way. And so I just want to avoid those kinds of people. That's all coming from a place of bitterness. It's possible, though, that when the writer of Hebrews brings up this concept of a root of bitterness, he's alluding to and quoting from Deuteronomy 29, where people can even be bitter towards God. Not that God has wronged anybody, but you can think that God has wronged you, and that's a false way of thinking. But in Deuteronomy 29, part of verse 18, part of verse 19, it says, beware lest there be among you a root bearing poisonous and bitter fruit, one who, when he hears the words of this sworn covenant, blesses himself in his heart, saying, I shall be safe, though I walk in the stubbornness of my heart. Can you imagine being the nation of Israel? Taken from Egypt, where there was all of these false gods, and then you're being brought into the promised land where there's all of these false gods. And it seems like when you're in the promised land that these false gods really do keep their promises. You worship Molech, and then you get whatever it is that Molech promised. You worship Baal, and you get the rain for the harvest. And it seems like your God is withholding everything. So how about this? I'll go to church every week, and I'll hear all the things that this law says and what I got to change in my life, but I'm not going to change a thing actually, because I think I can put these things above God throughout the week, and I'll be fine because God's withholding good things from me anyways, and I'm just going to be bitter against God. So in other words, if you've got a stubborn heart against God and you just don't want to do what he says, a lot of the times that can come from stubbornness, from thinking that God has not given you the life that you think you deserve. All right, with those things there, in Hebrews chapter 12, verse 14, it says to strive for peace with everyone, which would imply that if I'm somebody who is bitter, I'm somebody who doesn't have peace with other people. What people would I be most tempted to not have peace with? It's not going to be people who are distant from me. It's going to be people who are close to me. So your temptation to be bitter has less to do with how great the wrong is and more to do with the closeness of the wrong. For example, if you heard about some great injustice in the world, you probably saw that in the news and went, man, I can't believe that happened. That's frustrating. But it's a whole other thing when somebody in your family doesn't give you the credit or the respect you think you deserve, and now you're bitter. So it's not how big the wrong is. It's not how terrible the atrocity was in the world that makes you bitter. It's how close it was to you that makes you bitter. All right, children, are you bitter towards your parents? Do you have these kinds of attitudes towards your parents? Mom and dad favored one kid over the other. Mom and dad didn't love me enough. Mom and dad didn't discipline me enough. Mom and dad didn't give me all the things that I wanted for my birthdays every year. Mom and dad this, mom and dad that. They didn't have the wisdom that I wish they would have had when they raised me. Blah, 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 all that kind of stuff. What about spouse to spouse? Husbands, you bitter towards your wife? Wives, you bitter towards your husband? Husbands, you don't feel like your wife has respected you like you think you deserve? Wives, you don't feel like your husband is loving you like you think that you need? Do you notice that in these passages, it's not making exceptions? It's just like blanket saying, you better get this thing out of your heart, and it's not saying that this is going to be easy, but it is saying you've got to get this figured out. What about bitterness towards employees? I've been here for 6,000 years and I haven't gotten promoted and I haven't gotten the raises that I think I deserve, and all these people that I work harder than, they're the ones getting the promotions and blah, 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 blah. What about bitterness towards one another? Do you know how many opportunities we have to wrong each other in a local church? Well, I wasn't selected to be an elder. I wasn't selected to be a deacon. I wasn't selected to do the song leading. And I wasn't asked to do the prayer this morning, even though I made it known that I could do the prayer this morning. And I wasn't asked to teach the kids class, even though I've been waiting for a couple quarters and I still have no. And we just stew on these things and nurse these things until eventually we start having these prickly thorn bushes come out of our speech. Examine yourself and ask yourself what kind of fruit you're producing. Do you realize that the more you nurse this kind of stuff, your grudges that you have nursed have eclipsed any kind of victimhood you have had? And the Bible holds you accountable. So then the question is, how do you heal this? How do you heal bitterness from your heart? Maybe at this point everybody's feeling guilty because I think all of us are tempted to be bitter about something or towards somebody. Do you know how a Pharisee would try to heal bitterness? In Matthew 23, verse 26, Jesus says about them, "You blind Pharisee, first clean the inside of the cup and the plate, that the outside also may be clean." Do you know how a Pharisee would heal their bitterness? They would find a bunch of YouTube videos and all kinds of books like How to Win Friends and Influence People or whatever, and they would try to have certain kind of mannerisms that show, I can smile this way, and I can show you that I really care about you because look at the tone of voice that I'm using. And look at how much I just love people. Can you act all that kind of way but have rottenness in your heart? If you went to a tree that was not an apple tree and you stapled apples on it, would that fundamentally change the DNA of the tree? Would that make it an apple tree? No. How about I go to a thorn bush and I start cutting the thorns off? Would that fundamentally change the DNA of the tree? No, it wouldn't. But what a Pharisee would do is learn tips and tricks on how to modify my behavior without having to really dig deep into my heart and realize what's wrong in my heart. I'm just going to change my tone of voice and become gentle. And now people will think I'm not bitter, but you're just deceiving yourself. What is it that we should do to heal this? Two things. Reason frankly with the people that have wronged you. When Hebrews 12:15 begins by saying, "See to it that no one fails to obtain the grace of God," it's saying, you keep one another accountable. See to it. You guys talk about things with one another. In verse 14 of our text, strive for peace with everyone. Well, how am I going to do that? One of the ways that it's got to happen is by having real conversations with people. I love what Leviticus 19:17 says. You shall not hate your brother in your heart. Okay, well, how do I do that? What's hating your brother in your heart? This is bitterness. But you shall reason frankly with your neighbor, lest you incur sin because of him. So here's the two options. You keep hating that person in your heart, or you go and reason frankly. You have an open, honest conversation about what's happened. Or the New Testament version of this, Matthew 18:15, if your brother sins against you, go and tell everybody else his fault. That's not without, maybe that's a different translation. Go and tell him his fault. Between you and him alone, if he listens to you, you have gained your brother. Why is it that reasoning frankly with somebody would heal something? Have you ever had a time where theoretically in your mind you're frustrated, you can't believe this thing happened, and you're like, no, all that kind of stuff? And there's something about theoretically thinking about things as opposed to actually sitting down face to face and seeing the emotion of the person, and it reframes the whole discussion and your whole way of thinking about everything. When Samantha and I were first getting to know each other when we were dating, we grew up from very different kinds of backgrounds. I grew up in a family that just bluntly said, if you smelled bad, put deodorant on, go take a shower. Samantha grew up in a family that kind of danced around things a little bit more. And so when we started dating, I would say, this is what I think. And she'd go, I've never heard anybody talk this way. And I'm like, yeah, that's how it is, though. And so the way that we had to work it through and to not be bitter towards one another as we were getting to know each other was we'd have to say things like, hey, this is my perception of what just happened. You can tell me if I'm completely wrong, but we need to talk with each other about this so that we don't let the sun go down on our anger, so that we don't let bitterness stew. I felt this when you said that. Am I wrong about that perception? Is there anybody that you need to have a conversation with? Where you can say, maybe I'm imagining the wrong, I might be missing some of this, but all I can tell you is that this is what I feel. Tell me where I'm wrong. If there's something you need to confess to me, then let's have a real conversation about that. But if the only thing you want to do is walk around and complain about it to everybody else, the only thing you're going to do is allow that bitterness to continue to stew. In Matthew 18:15, it says, if you go and he listens to you, you've gained your brother. If they've wronged you, you don't have your brother right now or sister. It's like the relationship's been severed. But you could gain it back if you would take the courage, not in an accusatory kind of way, but to say, hey, this is my perception of what's happened. Please tell me if I'm missing something. Can we please talk about this? But do you realize that in Matthew 18, we don't have all the passages here. There's going to come a time where people won't listen to you. And then you got to go bring 2 or 3 witnesses, and then even if they don't listen to them, you bring it to the elders, and then the elders have to discipline that member of the church. Insofar as you can do, try to make peace with everybody, but not everybody wants to make peace with you. So if you've tried reasoning frankly, the other thing, and this is something that always needs to be going on, is you need to replant your bitterness with grace. In Ephesians 4:31 and 32, it says, let all bitterness and wrath and anger and clamor and slander be put away from you, along with all malice. Be kind to one another, tender-hearted, forgiving one another, as God in Christ forgave you. You need to take the bitterness out and replace it with God's grace. But for me to even start that process means that I've got to acknowledge and realize that I have that bitterness within me. Last week, I think it was 2 weeks ago, when I was doing the college campus study, I learned that you guys call them splinters here, but we called them slivers in Minnesota. If you've got a little piece of wood in your finger or something like that. How am I going to remove a splinter, not a sliver? How am I going to remove that unless I know that I have one to begin with? Remove the bitterness. Are you saying I'm bitter? You better examine yourself and find out if you are. How dangerous is it that Paul says this in a letter that's going to be circulated? He says, let not some bitterness. He doesn't say let half of your bitterness. He says, let all bitterness. And this letter is going to be circulated to a bunch of places. This is dangerous, Paul, because you don't know every circumstance. You don't know what every person has done. You don't know what everybody's going through, Paul. How can you just in a blanket way say all bitterness, get it out? Well, maybe because it's just wrong, period. So often we're tempted to look at the person who has wronged us and not think enough about what we've allowed that person to do to us. Viktor Frankl, the Jewish psychoanalyst, said, when we are no longer able to change a situation, we are challenged to change ourselves. You ever been backed into that corner? You want to manipulate this person and change this and change that and change this, and you eventually get to a point where you can't control things like you thought you could, and now you've got to look at yourself and go, well, I better change. Where's the power to do this? How do we find the power to do this? In verse 32 of Ephesians 4, forgiving one another as God in Christ forgave you. Was Jesus bitter towards you? You think when he came down and he was growing and he knew what his mission was, do you think he just looked at everybody every time he was in a room filled with sinful people that he was preaching to and going, oh, what a bunch of disgusting people. I can't believe I'm going to have to die for these losers. You think he just had a sour attitude? He didn't have that towards you. But yet you think you've got the right to have that attitude towards others? When you bring fire and water together, there's only two options. If you bring fire and water together, the fire is going to be greater than the water, and the water is going to be vaporized. Or the water is going to be greater than the fire, and the water is going to douse the fire. These two things can't coexist, though. If you've got the fiery embers of bitterness towards somebody else, what is it that you're not thinking enough about? What God did for me. And how dare I think that the wrongs people have done against me are greater than the wrongs I did against God? If I continually remember what God has done for me, and every time those embers want to start coming up into a flame again, I douse it, and I say, this is what Jesus did for me. This is what God did for me. He has not been bitter towards me. He sent his son to die for me. Do you suppose that over time, the embers would die, and the water would continually cause that to be the reason? You can eventually get to a point where you can say, that person wronged me, but I forgive them because that's what God has done for me. And maybe you see why in Hebrews 12:15, where it says, see to it that no one fails to obtain the grace of God. Because the person that's bitter and unforgiving is somebody who never sought to obtain the grace of God to begin with. They never sought to have it transform their heart so that they could show those same attitudes to other people. Do you remember that time when the nation of Israel was in the wilderness? They had crossed the Red Sea. And the first story after they crossed the Red Sea was that they had bitter water. Exodus 15:23 and 24 says, when they came to Marah, they could not drink the water of Marah because it was bitter. Therefore it was named Marah. And the people grumbled against Moses, saying, what shall we drink? And he cried to the Lord, and the Lord showed him a log, and he threw it into the water, and the water became sweet. This is not normally how you would sweeten water. But perhaps this is a foreshadowing of another tree, that if that tree gets thrown into something bitter, it can make it sweet. You see the point? Your heart may be filled with all kinds of bitterness. But there's a greater tree that Jesus was sacrificed on. And if you keep taking the cross and the sacrifice that Jesus made for you, and you keep throwing it into your bitter waters, eventually you could become somebody who's sweet. But it's only going to come by discipline in your yard, in your backyard. The only kind of thing that grows when you're not intending to cultivate the ground are thorns and thistles. But if you want to be intentional, you can grow a garden filled with all kinds of useful fruit. If you're not giving any attention to your attitudes, the only kind of thing that's going to grow are thorns and thistles. But if you want to cultivate something beautiful, it's going to take discipline, and it's going to take work. And the work that we have to do is thinking and meditating on what the Lord has done for us, taking that tree and throwing it into the embers of our bitterness in our heart. If there's anybody here this morning that needs to get their life right with God, remember that what's at stake here is that you might not obtain the grace of God. This could be a matter of life or death, because it would be evidence on whether or not God's grace ever meant something to you to begin with. We're about to sing the song, Nothing But the Blood. This song is water being poured on a bitter heart. Will you sing it in such a way that it'll help heal your heart? If there's anybody here that needs any help or any encouragement, please come forward while we stand and while we sing.